right, so here we go for our big audience. Thank you for joining Maximize Your Impact with Strategic Communications. For most of you, I'm assuming, for smaller NGOs or even bigger NGOs, communication is often an afterthought. It's not considered or recognized as the really valuable tool that it can be. This is usually because everyone thinks they can do communications. We know how to write, we know how to do social media, and therefore organizations miss out on all of the impact that strategic communications can have. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and that's why I am so glad that you were able to join. Here is an agenda. So we'll do some brief introductions and discussion, and then we will talk about the two kinds of communications that there are. That'll be followed by an introduction to strategic communications. And at the end, an overview of how you can build your communications infrastructure to be the most effective and impactful as possible. So you're thinking strategically about how to do communications. Before we start, let me ask, do you all know how to raise your hand on Zoom? Can you, Siddharth, for example, can you raise your hand just so we can check that? Okay, yeah, terrific. What I like to do, I love discussion and I love questions. So I really encourage you not to hold back and to raise your hand. And then whenever I come to a pause, and there are several of them, we can pause for conversation and discussion. So first, about me, I am Dietlind Lerner. I started my career as a journalist. I was based in Europe and I covered Europe and Africa for about 12 years for lots of the BBC, TF1, ARD, Channel in Australia, US publications and so forth. And it was great. It was very interesting. Here I am in Rwanda. It was an opportunity to talk with people and learn about the world. And I learned important communication skills such as how to write and how to pitch and think about a target audience and how to tell a story. But after a dozen years, I became frustrated by watching, and I wanted to actually, like all of you, I assume, because you're all in the nonprofit sector, I wanted to create change. So I went and joined Greenpeace in 2007. Here I am in Indonesia talking with some people in Sumatra about deforestation to understand what they were experiencing and to tell their stories on behalf of the organization and build a campaign. And that was terrific. And I did that for about 12 years, Greenpeace, and then various other, I was a communications director for several international NGOs. During this time, I discovered strategic communications. This is what we'll talk about later on, but it's the science behind communications. It's how we use communications as a tool to achieve our objectives. So I'll tell you more about that later, but I became so excited about the science and the power that it has that I ultimately decided to become a consultant, to go freelance. And here, oh, sorry, that's a photo of me here in the bottom, working on a World Bank project where we were promoting women's financial inclusion in developing countries. That's a big meeting we had. And that's just one example of the type of coaching and consulting that I do. What about you? I'd love to hear just a little bit about who you are and what your organization strives to achieve. So Siddharth, why don't you go first?
Sure, thanks. So I am Siddharth Thakur. I'm the Organizational Development Specialist with the Global Climate Fund. We work with our grantees. So my role is to work with the grantees and help them with scaling up their organizations. So that includes strategic planning, business planning, and any other specific organizational need. And this training is being held as part of one of our initiatives that we are doing in partnership with Nonprofit Builder. So yeah, and I'm based in the Bay Area, California.
Terrific. I'm so glad you're here. I think that organizational development is one of the most important things we're seeing in philanthropy these days, especially on the back of all of the social changes and the realization that we want to really empower the people we're striving to support so that they can move forward on their own, and that they grow strong and they know their issues better than we do in most instances. So thank you for joining. All right. So 2 types of communication. So what I want to make clear is that the 2 types, they really look the same to a very large degree. One is basically communication, and then the second is an offshoot, strategic communication. So you're talking about the same tools, reports, social media, galas, campaigns, etc., but just used a bit differently. So the first type, communication, if you look it up in a dictionary, I looked it up in Merriam-Webster, which is a major English language dictionary, you see that communication is the act or process of communicating, of exchanging ideas, all right? To express or exchange information, sorry. And that's important because it's what we're doing right now. It's it's what people do day to day without really thinking about what they're doing. I'm sorry, I have a cough. So that's what communication is. And that's why most people in nonprofits often tend to think that they can communicate, because they talk to their friends, they're on social media, they write emails, they know how to do all of that. Where the science comes in, where the really interesting stuff comes in, is strategic communications, which is not yet in the dictionary, but it is a term that's being used in business schools and in communication studies. And the UCS Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, which is one of the best in the world, defines it as such: the purposeful use of communications by an organization to fulfill its mission. So let me give you some examples of this. Or here, I'm sorry, I'll break it down again. So once again, 2 types of communication, both use the same tools. General, we are communicating to exchange information. We tell things we think are interesting. And strategic, we use it as a tool to persuade our target audience to take a certain action. If we do this generally, and I'll give an example. I was talking to a client the other day and they said, yes, our executive director really wants to do a video for this presentation, for this report that we just did the other week. Turns out that they want to do a video, but they don't know who is going to see the video, and they don't know why the people would watch the video, but they think it's a good idea. So they'll put it up on the website. There's a chance people will watch it. There's a much greater chance, in my experience, that they won't watch it. Strategic communication says, we have a new report. Who should see that report? What is our means of getting it to the people who want to see it? And then you decide, is it a press conference? Is it a video? And so forth. Here's a statistic. So I just mentioned a video. When I was working on a project at the World Bank, someone shared this with me. This was the year 2014, I think. More than 31% of policy reports that year were not downloaded. Okay, so what is that? That's 69% of reports were downloaded. Only 69%, right? Were downloaded. Now, how many times have you downloaded a report and not read it? Okay. Almost 87% were never cited. I just got goosebumps. It's such a shame. So here you have this organization, the World Bank, trying to do good. People working at the World Bank are saying, oh, I'll do a report on this. I'll do a report on that. They get the money, they do the research. Before COVID, they travel, they write, and they put this out in the world, and nobody looks. Given all of our challenges, the idea that we as civil society, as do-gooders, are producing things and wasting our money and our time on items that have no impact is a shame. All right. So let me ask you, have you ever produced a report or a video or an op-ed or a press release or something that nobody looked at? I'm going to put you on the spot, Siddharth, because you're the only one, but maybe you haven't. But I can. Anna probably has examples. I don't know. Or Patricia, do any of you have examples? Have you ever written an op-ed, been in an organization like, oh, we can write this op-ed, and never runs, or a video?
Well, fortunately, I have written a couple of reports in my previous roles. Fortunately, they were reasonably well received.
Okay.
But I believe they were slightly different in nature because they were client-focused reports. So the client was more interested in them. They were not op-eds.
Yeah.
They were not targeting a wide audience.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because the first kind of communication where you're talking to an audience and you have an ongoing conversation, that's, you don't need to be strategic about it because you've already developed that relationship. And so you're just, you know how to exchange information. It's with the audiences that you need to come to your support, that you need to come and help you achieve your goals, that you need to think strategically. So yeah, I mean, in my experience, I've worked with maybe 70, 60 nonprofits, and I myself have written I've written op-eds that ran in the New York Times and the FT and so on, because we knew our audience. But I've written many because someone wanted to say something and there was no plan about who needed to hear it or what it would achieve. So next. All right. So now for strategic communications, once again, we're talking about the same tools. And that also means these kind of tools here, which are elements of communications that I think all of you should know at this point as grantees. I'm assuming you know. And if you don't, these are things that I help organizations develop or fine tune, but we'll review really quickly what they are, 1, 2, and 3, in order to move forward, as this is the basis for communications or strategic communications in particular. So your mission statement, which asks, basically who you are and what you're going to do, and what is the problem you seek to fix and how are you going to fix it. Your theory of change, which goes a bit more in depth and really looks at who are the organizations and the people who can help you create change, right? So if, unfortunately, today you were working at a major peacekeeping organization and you were talking about the crisis in Ukraine, you want to accomplish peace, how can you achieve it? By finding compromise or understanding between Russia, the United States, and world powers, and then which people or organizations can help you, that's a question. Is it academics? Is it finance? And so on. That's just off the top of my head because of what's going on this morning. But that's your theory of change. And then from your theory of change, you're going to focus on your audience. Again, so this is not like what we were talking about with Siddharth. This is not where you have a client and that's your specific audience, but rather when you're trying to achieve something and you are looking at who can help you achieve it. So I'll show you an example on the next slide, but just to review, who can help you achieve your goal? What do they need to hear to want to help you? And how do they normally get their information? So broken it down here. These are some common audiences, people you need to reach. So this is not the case in every campaign or every work stream, but these are just some common audiences. So government, business, civil society. And these are common secondary audiences who can influence the top audiences. Let's say you can't get to the lawmakers or the business or the civil society who can make the change, then maybe these people, the second group will help you convince the first group. So experts, general public, and media are often second tier audiences. So for the first tier audiences, you're going to want to get as specific as you can. The more specific you are on who you're talking to, the more targeted your production will be. So, for example, are your lawmakers? I had a client the other day who said, yes, in India, we want to reach lawmakers. And then the question was, do you want to reach national, regional, or local? Do you want to reach the prime minister's cabinet, or do you want to reach, is it the energy secretary, the climate secretary? The more specific you can get, the more luck you'll have, because if you're trying to convince an energy secretary, they're going to want to hear something different from a climate secretary. The energy secretary, I'm guessing, will likely want to hear about how we can get more energy for less money, whereas the climate secretary will likely want to hear this is how we lower our greenhouse gas emissions, right? So this is an example of how you want to think about your audiences and targets. This is complicated stuff, so I'm going to give you an example here. But before I give you an example, are there any basic questions about, okay, great. So here is a case study. This is one I got to be involved in, and it was a great learning experience and also very rewarding. So I was at Greenpeace International in 2008. The mission of Greenpeace International that year was to ensure the ability of the Earth to nurture life in all of its diversity. So the big challenge, if you're going to keep the planet safe in 2008, and unfortunately still today, the big challenge is climate change. So Greenpeace was basically focusing on climate change. And we were looking at, because we were, I think in 29 countries and very big and powerful organization, we broke down our mission and our theory of change into 4 campaigns. We looked at renewable energy, forest, climate, and oceans. I think we also had a policy track. Anyhow, I was on the forest campaign. And instead of saying we're going to protect all the forests, oh, by the way, in case you don't know, forest deforestation is responsible for about 20% of greenhouse gas emissions, right? And that might be even a little bit different now, but if we save the forests, we keep emissions and we lower emission rates. And so we looked at 3 tropical forests or rainforests, the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and Indonesia. So this is how we broke down our theory of change, because we were so big. And this you'll often see, you'll have in your organization, you'll have a theory of change that works for the whole organization. And then you break it down and have a theory of change for individual campaigns, but it needs to reflect and feed into the top mission of your organization, right? So it wasn't, plant more plants. It was plant more plants because it might help reduce carbon emissions. Anyhow, so let's go. So what we did in the forest campaign in 2008, we were starting our campaign. So we wanted to look at who, let me do this. We wanted to look at who could help us, what they needed to hear, and how we would reach them. And so I wanted to ask you guys for ideas. If you were, even today, but more, if you were running a campaign on ending deforestation in Indonesia or elsewhere, well, let's stick with Indonesia, although Brazil might work as well, or Congo, who would have the power to stop deforestation? Anna, Patricia, Siddharth, do any of you want to suggest a target audience?
Definitely the policymakers for stricter policies around managing forests.
Yeah. And who in particular?
I would say the provinces with more forest cover. and and some little bit at the national level as well.
Yeah. Anna, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm thinking about perhaps those who actually do the actual removing of forests. I guess it's the companies, perhaps. Yeah, the business, and
Yeah.
on one hand, but on the other hand, maybe I would. Maybe that goes more for the other target audiences, because, well, there are people who are involved directly, but there are like wider masses who could kind of, by spreading the word, who could also influence the ones who would be consumers, and actually and wider population. Yes.
So these are great. And what would you so I'm assuming companies who deforest in Indonesia. What would your policymakers need to hear, if the local ones? What are you going to say to them in their forests in Indonesia to get them to stop the companies or from deforesting?
Actually, come to think of it, I think since it is a global issue, there has to be some involvement of some multilateral agencies as well, because only then would the national level policymakers probably take it more seriously, because it is not only an Indonesia specific issue. They have their own self-interest and economic interests, but it's a global issue.
Yeah, exactly. So this is great thinking, and this is how we started. And I'm going to show you what we did, and then, but that's how I want you to start anytime you produce anything, to think like that. So what we did was, we looked at government, and after we researched, we realized that in Indonesia, the governments, especially the regional, they don't have the capacity to stop big companies. They're not, and often they wouldn't have the motivation, right? Because they want to get elected, and if they stop jobs for people and so on, it's not going to interest them. So we were looking at international governments, the UNFCCC, so there was an upcoming COP, UNGA, and also various presidential elections, with the message to governments that the only way you're going to, that halting deforestation is a relatively easy and extremely effective means of curbing climate change. We thought that's what governments need to hear. And so we developed, So we developed reports for them. And we gave them the reports at the COP in Copenhagen and at other events. We went to business. Now, business, at this point, there's more, I think now, 12, 13 years later, businesses are much more aware of climate change and the need to be good and protect our planet. At that point, they were less so. But there was already an organization in Indonesia called the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. And it included all the major businesses that were working there. And so we did some research, and we looked at the major companies, and for a variety of reasons, we chose to focus on Unilever, partially because they had products like Dove soap and Nutella that everybody was using, and partially because they were based in the Netherlands, we were there, and so on, a host of reasons. But we did our research, they were the ones. And the argument, we couldn't go to them and say, hey, you're causing deforestation, because that didn't work with Exxon and Shell and tobacco and business in general. There are exceptions, but most it comes down to a bottom line. So what we thought they needed to hear from us was, look, if you keep doing this, your customers are going to get angry, right? And we needed to have facts as well, so that we had credibility. And then The secondary targets were the general public. So we wanted, as Anna suggested, to get them to complain about palm oil. And then an interesting thing happened. We had a very small, I think we had like 18 people in Indonesia and Amsterdam, primarily in the UK. So it's a small team when you think about how large Unilever is. And we didn't have that much money or anything at that point for this campaign. And so we kept on researching and looking at Unilever, and in a recent article, or I think it was a shareholder report, they had written about their campaign and how they were so good to women and they were protecting young generations through this campaign that they were running for Dove soap. The older people on this call might remember it, but it was a thing that, and they had just won a prize in Cannes at the advertising festival. So we said, all right, that's how we're going to get to them. We're going to embarrass them in the advertising world, because that's what they're talking about, right? The general public will come to next, but we're just starting. So we need to gain momentum. So we're going to start with the advertising world. It's a target audience I've never targeted before or after, but this was what worked in this case. So here we go. This is the ad that Dove ran. I'm going to show you the whole thing. It's a little over a minute.
Younger, smaller, lighter, fuller, tighter, thinner, softer. It really works.
So talk to your daughter about the beauty industry before the beauty industry does. So they're positioning themselves, look, we care so much about children and we care so much about the world. And they really, this was big news in 2008. So this was our response. So this is videos are a common tool, right? And if we'd said, let's make a video without doing our research, we probably would have made a video with graphics about this is how deforestation is happening and so and so and so, and sent it out. It might have been effective, but this video, Unilever called us, I think it was 5 days later. They haven't stopped completely, but they came to the table, they agreed to be our leader, they agreed to listen if we wouldn't do any more of this campaigning. the day we got that call was very exciting. So that's one example of thinking really strategically about what you're creating. Okay, Siddharth, do you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, this was a very powerful example, and this is great. So, who was your audience with this ad, and how was the? Mhm.
That's a great question. Sorry, I should have mentioned. So what we did, once we had the video ready, we sent it to Unilever and we sent it to all of the advertising publications. We also just sort of, we sent it to, I mean, this is 2008, so the internet was not as powerful as it is now, but we also sent it to bloggers and anyone who likes a good story. So that was, our target audience was Unilever, but it was getting people to almost laugh at Unilever, you know, to say, you guys think you're so great, but do you see that spoof? So that anytime they went and they said, we have this great campaign, the people that they meet, oh yeah, I saw that spoof that Greenpeace did, right? So they're like, I don't want to talk about the spoof. I want to talk about my campaign. So that was the audience. Now, this was, it wasn't too expensive for us because we had the video, we had someone in Indonesia, but it's still a bigger budget than most of you are going to have. So I'm going to show you another campaign. So this is a smaller campaign. This campaign had $1,000 budget. Okay, so really not big. Center for Justice and Accountability is a San Francisco-based human rights organization seeking to deter torture, war crimes, crimes against humanity. They are fantastic, and I am always impressed by these lawyers who deal with just the most brutal cases. So their theory of change is win precedent-setting cases. Now, the problem with this is that when you bring a case to trial, so for example, there have just been some cases in Germany, war crimes cases in Germany of Syrian massacres. And they can take 2 or 3 years or 4 or 5 to come to court. And then it's often not easy to see what happens on the ground because these cases happen elsewhere. So there was a thought internally at CJA that maybe it would be a good idea to build campaigns on top of the cases, and that this would help get countries closer to achieving this mission of having fewer war crimes, crimes against humanity, and so on. And so the idea in 2018, because they were just bringing a case to court in the US of a Liberian war criminal, was to focus on Liberia, where there were 2 back-to-back civil wars in the 1990s that were so brutal and so horrific, just beyond belief what people do to one another in these situations. And once the two wars had more or less ended, the agreement was that no one would be held responsible, basically, but that there would be a truth and reconciliation process, as there was in South Africa. So, you know, if you take everyone to court, the idea was if we take everyone from one tribe or one group or one persuasion to court, then they are, you know, their followers will attack the others. You know, that you want to, after a war, you want to try and, well, nobody knows exactly what to do in post-conflict societies, but the idea was in Liberia to sort of just move forward. The problem is that you have today in Monrovia people who live next door to the people who raped or killed or murdered their families. So we did our theory of change here in audiences, and we decided that the first person who had the ability, the only person who could really make a war crimes tribunal happen was the president. And the only message, the only reason the president would do it is because we would put enough pressure on the president to say, look, your citizens demand justice, the international community demands justice. And the only way that the president was going to hear that is if it was in the media, or funders. If there were government funders or philanthropies, they too could put some pressure. And the other group who could make this happen would be the International Commission I guess maybe I should put this in the secondary audience. I guess I made a mistake here. It should go secondary, but they're the ones who can pressure the government of Liberia because it's dependent on outside governments, unfortunately. Other secondary audiences would include NGOs, churches, international human rights group, and the general public in Liberia, right? The case that we had was a massacre at St. Peter's Lutheran Church, where I think it was 250 people were killed with machetes in a UN protected church, or Red Cross protected church. So this is what we did. It was pure coincidence, but about 2 weeks before I was brought on for this, there was a presidential election, and President George Weah came to power. So Ellen Johnson Sirleaf had been president for a very long time. 2018, George Weah is elected. And so we knew he was going to take office, I think it was January 22nd or January 21st, 2018. And so that was great because that gave us a fresh start, and we had a peg. A peg is when something newsworthy happens and you can get more attention for what you're saying if you weave it into that. So we wrote an open letter to President Weah, which we sent to him. And then we had a press release about the open letter. And we got, in the end, I think 80 national and local NGOs to sign our press release. And then we sent it to the media in Liberia the day before Weah took office. And so, here we go. The day after Weah, he comes into office, and on all the front pages, it says George Weah in office, and each page had a story about human rights groups urge Weah to prosecute war crimes. So right away, he's like, oh, I just want to be, I'm president, isn't it great? And right from the get-go, this is an issue that's in front of his face. We then, we did a lot of social media, Twitter in Liberia. And then we got to a point where there was a lot of momentum. We worked with other groups, and we decided, okay, now what we need is for civil society, that means church groups and others, to become active and to be aware of this, because a lot of people weren't even talking about what had happened. By 2018, half the population hadn't even been born during the conflict. And so we decided that, after a little research, that the best way to reach people in Liberia, a country where I don't remember what the statistics are, but I think a huge proportion are illiterate. So they can't read, and if they can read, they probably can't afford a newspaper outside of Monrovia. So we're not going to reach them by newspapers, but what we can do is we can reach them by radio. And so we hired a Liberian group, a friend of a friend at an NGO knew a theater group, and they put together a radio play. I'm just going to play a very short bit.
Survival of the Lutheran Church Massacre. Today, we want to call on all Liberians inside Liberia and those living in other countries to join us memorializing July 29, 1990. But we will start by rubbing more small.
So this is something we decided to hire people on the ground because they knew their target audience. I've been across Africa, but I've never been to Liberia. So if I were to make a podcast or radio program, chances are it wouldn't work, right? So we hired people who understood the audience, and they did a radio play, and we bought airtime in 13 stations around the country, I think it was. It was very inexpensive, and we broadcast this all around the country, this play. And it had, it was very successful. People started talking more and more about the need for a war crimes tribunal. Then it was time for the UN Human Rights Committee to meet in Switzerland. They give money and support to Liberia. And so again, we released a press release, and we had a lot of support in Liberia by that point from civil society. And we were able to show the UN, and even there were people in Geneva, I think Liberians, who were able to go to the meeting and demand that Liberia finally have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This is a newspaper from 2021. The Senate is pushing the president to set up the War Crimes Tribunal. And so, yeah, that was a campaign. Again, I'd say radio was a little bit more creative thinking, but very little money. So $1,000, I bet you all have $1,000 for comms, I hope. That had great impact because it was so strategic, right? Because we knew exactly who we needed to reach. How am I doing in time? Okay. At this point, do you have any questions or comments?
This is a great example. It just goes on to show how just strategically planning for the right channels doesn't really require an investment of money, which is usually a big mental block for everyone. So running a national level or an international level campaign with just $1,000, I think that is excellent. Yeah. I'm just curious about how much you had to leverage on existing networks to get that message across, or on media, etc. Or how does that dynamic work? I ask because most of the grantees that we work with are still relatively new, and they do have great networks, but just want to understand what that dynamic is like.
Yeah, that's a great question. Here, fortunately, CGA has a terrific reputation, and so we right away we pulled in Human Rights Watch. So if you're working on climate, on human rights, Human Rights Watch is they're so good at media, and they had a lot of contacts. But CJA also had their own contacts, and then CJA, because of the cases that they were working on, they were able to pull in the Liberian diaspora movement, and through that make further connections. But what I would say to any group starting this is that a signed letter, a petition or something, it's they're tricky only because everybody has their own message, and you're going to have to make sure that the text that you use will please everybody, right? And that the people who sign it see an interest in signing it. So because we had Human Rights Watch with us, that gave us credibility to people who didn't know us. And people who didn't know us knew that this letter would get a lot of attention because Human Rights Watch was going to push it out by their machine. Nonetheless, I think even without Human Rights Watch, we would have been able to do a very big letter, and it would have been equally successful because it was the number of people who signed as opposed to how many people saw it that we highlighted. The trick is to get in there really early and to make your statement as broad as possible so that you're not going to alienate groups. So really, we need a war crimes tribunal. The people in Liberia deserve it. I don't remember what we wrote. I can find it, but yeah. So that's what I would advise. I always advise making friends with other organizations. I used to work on financial transparency, and we put together a coalition that brought together people who had politically different backgrounds, but all wanted financial transparency and accountability, because it's for the more conservative groups, it was because that's good for business, and for the more liberal groups, it's because the people on the ground benefit. Find things that unite you, and then work from there. All right, so part 4, building a communications machine strategically, and it's has to do with what you were just saying, Siddharth, as well. It's about how do you maximize your work? You know, so if you're putting out a petition, how can you maximize the number of people who sign it? But there are many different things you can do, and I'll show you in just a sec. I've put together a list of some of the things I think you need to do. I call it a machine because you want to have as much in place that works almost automatically, so that when you need it, it just goes, and you can spend more time thinking and less time doing. So for example, if you're already friends with a lot of other NGOs, then it makes it easier when it comes time to creating a petition to get it going. That would be part of a machine. I'm not going to go into detail in any of these slides because each one could be a 90-minute session or more on its own. But these are things that I teach when I coach people on making a strategic machine, and I think they're really worth highlighting. So I'll go through this, and then if there's some you want to discuss, we can do that with one or two. So these always, always ask who's the target audience. And for this, I suggest always having a template in your office that says, anytime you're going to produce something, who are you producing this for? What do they need to hear? So that people don't come and say, oh, it's for a general audience. Oh, we'll figure it out. Make sure they think through why you should be devoting your really limited resources to this. Then messaging and distribution strategy. We'll get to storytelling, language, output process, internal process, and reusing everything you do. So one is, these slides will be available later, so I'll let you read through them more in depth later, but the target audience. Two, your distribution. Is it a radio play? Is it a report? Is it a video? Three, include stories. Now, storytelling is a buzzword, but basically it's telling a story. It's wrapping a fact in a story, because people remember stories much more than they remember random pieces of information. Cognitive science suggests we're 22% more likely to, 22 times more likely to remember a fact when it comes framed in a story. We also pay attention to stories. Our minds as humans wander every hour. I think our minds wander about 80 times, like, what am I gonna have for lunch? How long is she talking? Why did she choose blue? Whatever, our minds wander. But once it's in a story, once we're telling a story, our minds are less likely to wander. So if we want to share a message, put it in a story. Also use visuals. There are all sorts of statistics. All of them show that, in Twitter and Facebook, even in this report, in this presentation, if I ask you to tell me about slides, you're most likely to remember the slides that had a photo. And then cool data, fun facts, and so on. Use of language, super important, super interesting. I could do 10 webinars on this because it is so fascinating, but how you frame your audiences. So people, they're not homeless people. They're people who are experiencing homelessness. And we don't say that just because it's a nice way to say it. We say it because when we think about them as people, we have more empathy and understanding, as opposed to when we tag them homeless people, that conjures a certain image. Linked to shared values. So not, oh, we're treating refugees terribly, but we all want love and understanding in families. We all want to be together. Bring in the Afghani refugee families. They want to be together. We don't want to have the saviorism. They can't wait. We need to help them. That sometimes raises funds quickly, but people don't stay engaged for the long term. And it's also, it alienates the groups you're trying to help. Tangible goals. Don't just talk about, oh, we need public education, but we need schools where our kids can learn. So these are just some examples of powerful, important language. Streamline your output process, so create an editorial calendar. These tools are free. So I can talk to you about them later, but there are so many good tools out there that are free, and then others, Canva, I should add that, that don't cost any money. And they'll save you tons of time. Create internal communications processes. Who signs off? How often are you communicating? People leave jobs because they're unhappy. They don't feel empowered. They don't feel included. Your staff, your team is your most valuable asset. They will talk to others. They will engage. They'll have ideas. Create processes, and I can help you do that, so that your team feels empowered and wants to help. Repeat everything. It takes 20 times for someone to hear your campaign message before they finally get it. That was research done a couple of years ago. Reuse. So marketing says that a client needs to see a TV ad 7 times before they remember it. And keep in mind that every interaction is an opportunity. So your email signature should have your mission statement. When you go to a summit, your whole team should be saying the same thing. Think ahead of time. If I meet a funder, if I meet a friend, if I meet, what am I going to say to them? And make sure that you're all repeating. Oh, I have one more case study that's fun that I could show you. But first, let me ask if you have any questions about these bits of the machine that I've just shared with you. Okay, so I'm going to take advantage of this and show you one more case study. And this is tied to the power of language. I have nothing to do with this, but it's such a great example. So in the United States, in 1996, so what is that? But 25 years ago, President Bill Clinton, a Democratic president, signs a law that defines marriage only as a union of one man and one woman, right? This is just 25 years ago. Law. 2000, 4 years later, we start to see a couple civil unions being allowed in some states, in Vermont. So it's not a church union, but it's a civil union, and you have certain rights, but only in Vermont. Because of this, because this was happening, anti-same-sex marriage campaigners, they got really active and nervous. And so they were able at the same time to pass laws in 3 states forbidding not only same-sex marriage on the regional level or state level, but also banning adoption by same-sex couples. 2003, the US Supreme Court decriminalizes homosexuality. So that's within this century, at the start of it, there was homosexual acts that were still illegal in the United States. 2004, Massachusetts legalizes same-sex marriage. So you see how this is going back and forth, but it's still super slow, right? November, voters in 11 states vote on ballot measures to ban gay marriage, including in very liberal states like California, right? So 2005, people get together, big funders and LGBTQ same-sex marriage people get together in Denver, and they say, look, we have to do something. We're going to pool our resources, and the way that we're going to create change is through communicating and changing the hearts and minds of voters. We're going to change norms. We're going to change what people think. We're going to use communications, right? So they started to conduct public opinion polls. And this research came up with 2 facts. One, that majority of Americans, a strong majority, opposed same-sex marriage, but that there was also a strong majority that was sympathetic to the unfairness of, say, as the same-sex couple, one person dies and the other is not allowed to inherit or is not allowed to visit in the hospital. So even they thought, okay, that's unfair, that gay couples don't have the same rights. And so this group from 2005, they said, okay, we're going to do a bunch of campaigns about the equal rights about how same-sex couples should have equal rights. And they created ads. One featured a man sitting in a hallway of a hospital with his head in his hands, and the caption read, you know, my partner is dying and I'm not allowed to be with him in his last moments. You know, we need our rights. And there were a series of ads like this, right? Up until 2009. 2009, more elections, 30 states are lost. So it's looking even worse. People are not voting. They say that this is what they think, but they're not, their actions are not showing it. And so the same group of people decide that they're going to invest in qualitative research to see why people are not voting for what they believe in. And they found that the Americans who were sort of on the fence, who weren't really sure, they wanted to give gay same-sex couples the right to marry. They wanted them to have the right to marry, but they were worried that it would change the definition of marriage. They were worried that it would make marriage a transaction, a financial or legal transaction. That's what the polling showed. So people felt like they were going to lose something. The marriage would no longer be romantic and about love. And so messaging change, communications change, and a slew of advertising comes out, primarily relatives and friends of same-sex couples saying, this is all new to me, I don't quite understand it, but they are just like us. They just want to love and establish families. And this was a first ad. It was known for being the most popular. This started everything.
We have 4 generations of our family sitting around this table. Dottie and I've been together for 59 years now. I flew in the last battle of World War II. I couldn't see how anyone who had been in combat could ever be cruel to anyone ever again. It takes a great deal of bravery to be a lesbian. I'm so proud of Katie and Alex.
We're pretty proud of you.
Oh, boy. Marriage is too precious a thing not to share.
I would, in my lifetime, really like to be able to see Katie and Alex get married legally.
This isn't about politics. It's about family and how we as people treat one another. We have 4 generations.
So I mean, that gives me goosebumps every time. 4 years later, the Supreme Court decided that Clinton's law was unconstitutional, and 2 more years later, gay marriage is legalized. So we're going from great setbacks in 2005, 1 decade later, enough people in the United States support gay marriage that politicians all agree, not all, but enough that it was time to make this legal. Obviously, more went into this. There was get out the vote, etc. But I think you can argue that communications was what changed things. This is the power of communications, and I love the story. So that's it. That was my final. I see there's a chat something, but I don't know if that's from you, Anna, or.
Yeah, that
Oh,
was-
I was just responding to something. That's okay. This is great. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. I have just a general question about what the journey looks like when a grantee starts working with you.
So I think the most important thing is to make sure that you have your mission, your theory of change, and your audience in place. And so depending on the level of the degree of knowledge about those things, because people often say, yes, we have a mission statement, theory of change, when in fact, they're not using them. They've created them and they're not using them. So at first it's a review of how they're looking, what are they set up to do? And then depending on that, I can either help with that or that it's enough. And then it's a progress. It's building out first that whole table of audience, what they need to hear, and distribution. And that, takes a little while. And always getting sign off from senior team, making sure that this is not just a comms project. I mean, I work with the comms person, but making sure that other people understand, or fundraisers, because this is valuable for fundraising or movement building, etc. And then once the plan is in place, then moving on to the machine, why are you using Instagram? Let's look, is your target audience on Instagram or is it on Twitter? And if they don't know how to tweet, teaching them how to tweet. If they don't know how to write or set up a newsletter, helping them set all of that up. And then what I really think is important is once all of this is in place, they can carry it forward themselves, because they'll have a plan and they'll have the machine, and they should be able to, either a communications person, or even in a worst case scenario, the intern can take it forward, but that they then check in with me or someone, preferably me, 3 months later to review. All right, how is this going? Were these the correct channels? What is coming up that's new? So it's a process first of building the strategy and then the machine. Does that answer your question?
It does. It does. So it's strategic support as well as the nitty-gritty of implementation and building the skills.
Yeah. I mean, the implementation and skills, that's what people often do. I had a client recently say to me at a major university, she was opening a climate center, and she said, yeah, I've got a first-year freshman who is really good at Twitter, so she's going to do all my Twitter. I said, oh, but you don't have a strategic plan. How's she going to know what to tweet? What language is she going to use? Who is she going to retweet? What images? So yeah, you have to have the strategy in place before you can. It's not worth it to just find a good tweeter.
That is so true. And I think that is one of the changes we have to bring about internally, as well as among the portfolio, that it's not just about tweeting or just sending out a newsletter. It's about really the strategic element that is important.
It comes back to what I was saying in the beginning. We all know how to communicate, and therefore we think we can do strategic communications because we send email to our friends. So, I'll send an email to the board. But it's thinking strategically. How often does the board want to hear from me? What does the board need to hear in order to take the actions that I want them to take? Do they want a video? That kind of stuff. So yeah, it's based on strategy. But you and I live very near to one another. So if you ever want to talk about this over a coffee.
Yes, we should. We definitely should connect. Yeah, great to find a fellow Bay Area resident.
Yeah. Sorry to the rest of you. We're both in the Bay, and it's kind of warm today, to make matters worse for you. But anyhow, Anna or Patricia, do you want to add anything, or?
Yeah, maybe just a question. For example, once communication is happening, would you provide tools or tips or methods to measure like efficiency, maybe some KPIs, for example, like you gave that recent case study about the marriage equality. It took 10 years to reach the goal. But how on the way towards that goal to know that the right thing is being done?
Yeah.
And,
well, I mean, they clearly had their KPIs because, what was it, 2005? They started out with the one kind of advertising that was talking about equal rights. And then when the election came, I think it was in 2009, but when the election came, they saw that they weren't winning. And so they weren't reaching their KPIs. And so they redid their strategy, their communications, and they changed their messaging. But in a much smaller example, I had a client who put out a report, and they knew that this report was not going to be of interest to a large number of people. They had a small target audience. And so they put out the report with a press release, and they put it on their website, and they're tiny. I think they have 3 people. And so we used Bitly to create the link for the report. Now, Bitly is a free tool, and you can change the end of the URL. So it's a URL link. In the end, you can say, you know, greatest report or network builder report. So that one, you're continuously branding, but the other help of Bitly is that on your Bitly board, free, you can see how many people have clicked on your report. So you're already able to say, now, of course, I just showed you a slide from the World Bank that says people click, you know, and don't download, but this was a smaller audience. So they knew, and they didn't send it to that many people. And I think 100 people at least clicked on it. So they were able to measure there. You can also, you know, in Twitter, you can see how many people are retweeting you or, you know, liking what you're tweeting, same in Facebook. So social media, it's easy. Let's say that you put out a press release, or in the Liberia instance, you know, you could say that your KPI was that the press release and the letter appear in 3 Liberian publications. You know, so yeah, there are definitely ways to measure. I always get a little bit nervous because with communication, you never know what else is going to happen on a certain day. You know, let's say that someone, I remember once writing a story about a book review. It was someone who wrote a book about Maria Callas. And there was all this big to-do about this book. And it went out on the day, and the article that I wrote went out on the day that they'd planned forever, which was September 11th, 2001. Nobody read that article. You know, you don't know what's going to happen in the rest of the world. So that sometimes makes things a little bit difficult, but you can plan for contingencies, especially now in a virtual world.
Yeah, that's true. And how like when you decide on with whom to communicate and how to communicate, whether there is some percentage or part of informal communication present or not, and how important it is. Like, for example, you can, of course, communicate with the policy maker in a very targeted way and communicate certain message of the organization, or you can just send that policy maker, let's say, happy birthday message.
Sure.
And it's also a way, or for example, to go to some informal gathering and just do some bonding with particular people who can have the strategic importance. So how do you approach that part, maybe, if you do?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think, you know, when you talk about like political campaigns, I'm thinking about Washington, you know, you can go and see the lawmakers and talk to them, or you can go to hearings and ask questions. But I would go back a step and ask what motivates them to act. So are they going to be motivated because you talk to them at a cocktail party? They might, because it might be an issue they know nothing about. However, most of the time they're going to be motivated by, I'm sorry if I'm a bit pessimistic here, but they're going to be motivated by votes. So their home state contingency or voters, and they're going to be motivated by money and a slew of other things. So getting to know them might not be that worthwhile. It really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. I mean, there are also in some countries, or even in the US, you know, there are lobbying institutions, you know, there's bribery, there are all sorts of not good ways that we influence decision makers.
Yeah, that's true. And do you use such tool like for small NGOs? I imagine that bigger organizations, of course, use those. Like some celebrities or some person, like some persona, like for example, Greta Thunberg. She was like widely used for to promote certain. But at the level of small NGOs, that would be perhaps harder to achieve, or maybe it's still possible. But do you kind of use these methods or recommend such methods?
Oh, I mean, yeah, it's like, so those are your experts. So for example, they're your celebrities, and they're also your academics who are well known, or journalists who are well known. So, you know, it used to be if you got Nicholas Kristof to write about you in the New York Times, that was a great help because he had a lot of sway. Or Stieglitz, if you're writing on economics in the US or Europe. But celebrities, I've done a lot of work with celebrities, and for the most part, it's not worth it, I would say, because they are so, it's a lot of money and time and energy that you invest, and very often what you get out of it is not worth it. However, there are some celebrities who have made their causes clear, like Leonardo DiCaprio. One of the groups that I work with, they have a good relationship with him and Mark Ruffalo, who's also an environmentalist. And so they will actually put together something on climate, and then they will get in touch with Leonardo's press person who talks to him and says, hey, can you retweet this? And if he retweets it, their tweets go crazy, right? So that's a relationship that's really worth establishing. There are celebrities, I'm thinking, oh, I can't remember his name, but one celebrity in the US, his mother-in-law has Alzheimer's. And so he is very keen on solving means of solving Alzheimer's. So that's another way you could think about getting to celebrities, is through causes. So yeah, that can help.
Okay. Yeah. Well, just maybe a couple of other questions. What I also noticed that there are some nonprofits with whom we work. They may not even have a website, so their online presence is very like small.
Yeah.
And also they might be located in the countries where there's not much internet, and maybe people don't even have computers mostly. And maybe even their target audiences are not those who would use computers. Let's say they're based in rural areas and they're focusing more on campaigning work, and they need to reach people in the rural areas. So what would be efficient like tools or approaches to reach those audiences, and how to measure as well?
No, that's really important. It comes back to who is your target audience and what do they need to hear? Because let's say that someone wants to support maternal health in Malawi. Their power analysis or theory of change might require outside investors to come in and build clinics or to design programs. In that case, they need to have a website, because they have decided that the person or institution that can help them the most is a group that is going to need a website. However, if they decide we're going to do this by changing social norms, the way that the same-sex marriage group did in the US, then in Malawi, they would probably want to concentrate on radio, and they would look at design thinking is what I would recommend, and that's something I didn't have the time to get into here, but design thinking is really developing products and tools that reach target audiences. And I think IDEO.org, which is a great design thinking group, I think they were the ones who did a project with Mary Stopes on something very similar, and their research, they did all the research, the communications and so on, and they decided that the best way to support maternal health was to work with teenage girls. And they learned through trial and error that the best way to talk with teenage girls was in an informal setting, and to talk about the dangers of, I don't want to say the wrong thing, but it was something about when and with whom to have sex and what were the more dangerous situations. Okay. Anyhow, these girls, they for the most part couldn't read and wouldn't have gone to centers. And so the solution that they came up with was to organize free nail salons. Mm-hmm. And so they had a bunch of people, locals, who had nail salons, I think that's what it was. And they trained the people in the nail salons, they talked to them about maternal health. And through that, the nail salon people talked with the girls. and in this informal situation, peer to peer, and there were measurable changes on the ground, I think, in terms of birth rate. But this is all, you have to look it up. I'm remembering this through memory, but
yeah, that's a good example, actually. So
that's
that's very efficient, yes. And yeah, is that, do you want to ask something so that I don't take all the time available?
No, I mean, I think we're at the end, but I love talking. I love, like, not love, I love talking about this. So you can ask me questions for another, I think, 8 hours. Okay. But I don't want to keep you either. I mean,
I'm good, Anna. So if you have any questions,
Okay. Yeah. For example, yeah, I just have maybe 2-3 questions, just because it's true, they kind of somehow they keep on happening. But I'm lucky because in several hours I have another session with Dietlind, so I'll catch up there if there is still something I didn't get the answer. No, just kind of thinking, because now we live in this information world where the information is really in abundance. Everybody wants to reach our ears and our attention, and kind of, do you have any tips? When you do projects with nonprofits, do you have any tips like how to make sure that the information doesn't get lost? Because as you mentioned yourself, the reports may never be read, or newsletter can be also never opened even once it goes to the email. I mean, how to make sure that it's efficient? That
yeah, I've got a couple of, that's a good question. Let me write down, because I've got 2 thoughts on this. Okay, so the first is, I mean, people have been saying this for maybe 15, 20 years, you know, now that everyone can film, well, we still have professional camera crews and such. And, you know, we've seen lots and lots of video, but in terms, you know, proliferation of films and even TikTok, but I think quality is always going to win, or almost always going to win. If you have a choice between 10 stations and one has a higher quality in terms of the filming and the speaking and so on, for example, it will. So I about 5 months ago, I subscribed to, I don't know, maybe 40 online newsletters just to see what was out there. And I've whittled it down to, I think, 5, because they were the right length. They were presented in a way that makes them easy to read, and a variety of reasons. But you're always, quality is really going to be key. And then there's your machine. So if you're on Twitter, you want to keep, for example, abreast of what are the trends, like how many words maximum do you want? How many hashtags? I think right now it's 3 hashtags maximum. Twitter, I think it's 80% more likely to receive attention, a tweet, if there's an image. People wanted, at one point, it was video that had subtitles, because people were watching on their phones. This is before they were listening as much, and so they didn't want to make noise. They wanted to be able to read. There are all sorts of details in your machine that can help you be more efficient and really more targeted, so that you have a greater chance of reaching your audiences. Even like if you're using MailChimp to send out your newsletter and you have a bunch of links, look at who's clicking your links. You can do that in MailChimp, again, for free. Look at who's clicking, because that's going to tell you, hey, people like the jobs section, but they really don't like the calendar section, or whatever it is. And then, you know, put more jobs there perhaps, or put that higher. And then my slide 7, repurpose it. If you know people are interested in the jobs, because you've seen that on MailChimp, then maybe tweet about the jobs, or maybe, you know, put the jobs on your LinkedIn or whatever. You know, take your information and your analytics and repurpose it and use that to guide you, so that, yeah, you don't get lost in all the noise. And then the final is, if you can, and it depends on your target audience, but be original. You know, even, I'd say even for wonkier audiences, even for presidents and so on, I mean, you want to remain professional, but I think if you were targeting President Biden, he wouldn't mind a good laugh. You know, like if your video, instead of opening with scenes of violence, I mean, you don't want to get funny about violence, obviously, but think about a way, what is a man who has the weight of the world on his shoulders, and has 1,000 issues, how are you going to get his attention? Think originally, you know, is it he's got a dog and a cat? Is it, you know,
yeah, exactly. No, that's what
I think really quality and listening, looking at your analytics in your machine, and that includes distribution. So if you have friends, other NGOs, and you can say to them, hey, can you retweet my tweet? So I did that a lot with Human Rights Watch when I was working on Liberia. Can you retweet this? Can you retweet that? And yeah, so those would be my 3 tips off the top of my head.
Yeah, okay. I have the whole bunch of questions, which I probably wouldn't abuse your time right now. I'll keep them for the coming session, but maybe just the last one. Does it make sense to do communication in coalition with several like-minded NGOs? Would that be more efficient? Would that make sense?
Depends on the case. But, you know, right now, for example, I have a client preparing for the CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity, which is one of the 3 Rio treaties. And there is a huge, or even for the COP, any of you who work on climate, you probably know the Croissant Conspiracy, which is something like 180 NGOs working together on climate change, climate and biodiversity conservation. And they will, you know, share news, and they will have calls, and they will try and create joint messaging so that, remember before when I said you have to hear a campaign it's 22%, 22 times more likely. You have to hear it 22 times. If you're hearing the same thing from Greenpeace and WWF and NRDC and so on, you're going to take it in and you're going to believe it more because you're hearing it everywhere over and over again. So in that respect, yes. However, there are lots of nuances between environmental organizations, for example, you know, especially nuclear is the first that comes to mind. So if you're in a coalition with someone who says nuclear should count as a renewable, and one that says it shouldn't, you might not want to go into partnership with them because you might not want to send traffic to their website, for example. These are all nuances. I mean, you might say climate change is the most important, therefore I don't care about the distinctions. These are things you have to look at internally, but no, coalitions can be great. And coalitions can also, you know, you could say if it's a global issue, if you're in a coalition, you could say, look, it could be an unofficial coalition. You could say, look, we're really strong in Brazil, but we're weak in Congo Basin. So we'll work on the Amazon and you guys work on the Congo Basin. And that'll be under the radar that we split it up, but we'll help you guys with our media contacts or whatever. Yeah.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you very much. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dietlind. I think on this note, we will not take much of your time anymore, but thanks a lot. It was really a great presentation, really super.
Thank you for letting me talk about it, because again, you can see my hands, I get a workout when I talk about it.
Yes. No, it was indeed great. And yes, Siddharth, yeah, he says excellent session. Thank you. You want to say something? Yeah.
Yes, very, very incisive, very insightful. I really learned a lot from this. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. And thanks, Patricia, for translating. And I'm sorry I don't yet speak Spanish.
Yeah, thank you, Patricia, as well. Yes, we will see Dietlind again today in 7 or 8 hours later today during the day for our Asian colleagues. But for the time being, thanks a lot to Dietlind and to Siddharth and to Patricia. Have a nice continuation of the day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.